young people especially get left behind when we get caught up in this classical definition of ambition, because that's not what ambition looks like for a lot of young people anymore. And that doesn't mean they're not ambitious. It just means they got different paths that they're on.
Welcome to Women Talk Tech, the podcast for business professionals committed to advancing women in the tech sector.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Women Talk Tech. My name is Maddie Yule.
And I am Elle Bush.
And we are the producers of this podcast. And we are not who you're used to. We are not Marie, but we're excited because we are starting a new little series on the podcast that we're going to call Producers Corner. And Elle, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so we have kind of identified a need to dive a little bit deeper into some of the topics that we like to touch upon in our interviews. And we decided that a great way to do that would be to create these special episodes called Producers Corner, where essentially we are planning and hoping to dive into some of these really important themes that the podcast touches on. And today specifically, we're going to be talking about ambition and what ambition means for younger people. And hopefully after this, we'll have many more to come on some other topics that we've been kind of itching to touch more deeply on. But Maddie, do you want to tell people what we do here and maybe a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess we'll start. So we're the producers of Women Talk Tech. So essentially what that means is if you have ever been on the show, you've probably chatted with us pre and post interview. We do the scheduling and also kind of like the big picture planning. So we've been having a really exciting year this year with a lot of really like specific series of episodes that we're doing. We're wrapping up our current series right now, and we're about to jump into a really fun one called We're All in Technology that is going to dive into people who don't necessarily work in the traditional tech sector. So we get to do kind of all the strategizing and planning behind that, and then also talking with the guests and kind of getting everything organized for putting the podcast out. And then I guess just a little bit about me. So I have been working at Marketing Copilot in Women Talk Tech since 2021, so for a few years now. And it has been really awesome. I just finished up doing a graduate program. I graduated from Queen's with my undergrad, and then I just went and did a graduate degree in publishing. And I'm also an artist, so I like to do lots of fun, creative stuff. But yeah, that's a bit about me before we just start talking at you. And Elle, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So as I said before, I am Elle. I started at Marketing Copilot and Women Talk Tech at the end of February of this year. So probably coming up, I don't know how to count, but I think that's 5 months-ish, 4 months.
Yeah.
I do very similar things to Maddie at Marketing Copilot. I work as like a community manager, and I do a lot of, the sort of day-to-day chatting with clients and on the podcast with guests, and kind of helping them execute what they need in terms of social media and branding. Outside of work, I am wrapping up my undergrad in art history, which feels like an interesting thing to say on this podcast because I'm not studying anything to do with tech. But like Maddie, I have a pretty deep appreciation for art and aesthetics. And I think that transfers really well into the podcast world and branding and all of that good stuff. And yeah, I'm just like super happy to be working on a podcast. I find it to be such a fun experience. And I love chatting and connecting with people. So this has been a really good job for that. Yeah. But why don't we introduce our topic a little bit further?
Yes.
Okay.
I can talk about that a little bit. So we have been talking about, if you kind of follow us on social media or listen to this podcast, we are talking a lot about ambition this year. And that started off with our ambition survey that we launched in January of 2023, because we kind of wanted to know how ambition among women and gender minorities shapes sort of how people advance in the workforce. And we wanted to know about the messaging that young people were getting about success and ambition and how that impacts kind of how they travel the path towards success in their life. So we just wrapped up our survey, and then we're able to kind of talk about our findings in the ambition report, which is out. Will be out when this podcast episode comes out, which is very exciting. It will be out on July 12th, which is super exciting. And when we were having our conversations about the findings of the report, we started to talk about the nature of ambition right now and the future of ambition and how it connects to younger generations and just the generational differences of how we treat and view ambition and how that also connects to the workforce. So Elle and I decided that we wanted to talk about that as resident young people. And we wanted to do some research and talk about that a little bit. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. And I think we should kick it off. So the first thing that I want to ask you, Elle, is what does ambition mean to you?
Great question. Marie asks us this a lot too. This is a conversation we repeatedly have as a team. Just constantly trying to understand how ambition changes from person to person. And I think for me, I used to have a very classical definition of ambition. And by that, I mean, I think I did definitely put a lot of my drive and energy towards career building, specifically also towards education. When I was in high school, I remember just constantly dreaming up of all of these different careers and ways to get to those places. And I was super ambitious about going to the school that I'm currently at. It was a very big goal of mine that I put a lot of energy towards. However, now in my life, I think it's a little bit different for me. I don't really consider ambition that often, which is funny because it's all we talk about at work. So now I've definitely been pondering it a little bit more deeply than I used to. I think I'm really just ambitious and driven towards a pursuit of constantly learning. And I think that I have learned through doing post-secondary education that doesn't always happen in a classroom, which is why I think I spend a lot of energy investing time and brain power towards, relationships, traveling, trying to learn in environments that are not necessarily marketed as spaces of learning, whether that be talking with someone at a coffee shop or I recently just got back from a trip and I always wanted to talk to people that I was meeting and ask about how they got where they are and where they're going. So I think a lot of my ambition now lies in just trying to learn as much as I can in as many ways as possible.
Hi, listeners. We are so excited to invite you all to join us on Thursday, September 14th at the in-person Women in IT USA event in New York, where Diversity Q and Information Age will bring together the Women in IT Summit during the day and the awards gala dinner that same evening. Join us for a day filled with valuable insights, thought-provoking conversations, and an evening of networking, delicious cuisine, and pure enjoyment. It's guaranteed to be a fabulous time. To find out more about the summit and awards ceremony and to book your tickets to attend, please visit womeniniTawards.com.
How do you feel about ambition, Maddie?
I feel very similar to how you feel, I think. I think, similar to you in high school, my ambition really lied a lot in post-secondary and getting to post-secondary and getting to the school that I went to. And I always was a person who changed my mind about what I wanted to do a million times. It was every week I had this new idea of what it was I wanted to do in terms of my professional life. And I think that really shows in my ambition now, because I wouldn't say that, I've gone to school and I've done that. And so now that part of, that ambitious pursuit, I've achieved it and I've successfully done that, which is great. So now I've, especially with all the conversations we've had about ambition, like you were saying with work, it's really made me be okay, what am I ambitious about now? Now that, school for me is done for at least this part of my life. And I think that overall, the consistent thing that I've always been ambitious about has been relationships and like my personal life and creating and fostering connections similar to what you were saying with like friends and family that are really positive and really like impactful. And so that's, I think, my overall, that has been a very consistent and constant source of ambition for me and like kind of where a lot of my drive comes from. But obviously, things change, and I am someone who I like to do a lot of things. So I'm definitely ambitious about certain things at different points in my life, and how long that ambition sticks around for about a certain thing varies. But consistently, it's always been like relationships and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think as two very creative people, if you don't mind me categorizing you as that, but I think also as two very creative people, like ambition shows up in so many ways and at so many weird times because you're constantly dreaming up these like new ideas and new things to put your brain and like heart towards. And I totally understand that kind of like, I have my hand in so many different buckets at all times, trying to like, do as much as possible. Totally. But I guess I'd be curious to understand, and I think that maybe you can provide some insight on this, is like, how have we got into where we have when we think of ambition today? Like, how has ambition been conceptualized over time? And like,
yeah, absolutely. So, as we talked about, these episodes are going to be a little bit more like research heavy. And I think that a really important part of research and talking about any topic is kind of providing a little bit of a historical context. So I went down an absolute rabbit hole of figuring out like, where did ambition come from? How long has it actually been around in human history? And how did it evolve to like the state that ambition is today? And what I found is that, for all of human history, ambition has been present. And I should mention as well, this section of kind of what I'm talking about comes from an article by John D'Alessandro called "What is Ambition and Where Does It Come From?" And in that article, he's frequently citing a book by William Casey King called "Ambition: A History from Vice to Virtue." So we'll mention like our sources, and then we'll have them in the show notes as well. So you can kind of also do your own research as well. But for all of human history, ambition has been present. And we know this because there is a really rich history of ambition actually being denounced for millennia in literature and history, in philosophy, and in theology. And the idea of ambition was really often conflated with temptation and sin and vice. And there are, things like biblical writings translated that directly cite that like God does not detests ambition, that he does not like ambition. And then there's like classic like mythical stories and warnings against ambition. And I think that the most common and the most popular would be the story of Icarus, which warns of like not flying too close to the sun. And that one was really funny when I was thinking about that, because that's like my favorite Greek mythology story. Like I love that one so much. And I never really, I guess obviously you know what the messaging behind it is, but then looking at it through this frame of like, oh, that's actually kind of, it's a little anti-ambition a little bit. And it also is a really heavy theme that's present in a lot of Shakespearean work. And is even like acknowledged by like critics of Shakespeare, or I guess historians of Shakespeare, as like one of the worst vices in his eyes present in his work. And he wrote in Henry VI, quote, "Banish the canker of ambitious thoughts."
Shakespeare hated ambition.
Shakespeare hated ambition.
Yeah.
But it's like not ambition in the sense that we understand it as it is today. It's ambition that is really conflated and tied up in sin and in vice and in temptation. Yeah. So we can kind of see that it started out as being like really aligned with a sense of like disorganization. And that's why people didn't like it, because to be ambitious is, I think, kind of inherently about not following a predetermined order. And so there is a sense of like disorganization and temptation and going against the status quo, and also like an ego to it as well. And then around then during the 16 to 1800s was called what's known as the Age of Enlightenment. It's also called the Age of Reason. And the gist of this, obviously this is like a hugely rich, dense history, but for our purposes, the gist of it was like this move away from religious authority over like the rulings of the state, and looking towards like Western science and logic and like reason overall to begin to understand the universe. And then also the key part of it is like understanding the universe and a person's position in it in order to improve their position. So out of the Enlightenment era came Western science, modern democracy, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, Galileo's discovery of the planets, the publishing of Newton's natural philosophy, and like much, much more. So here we can kind of see that like ambitious ideas and the pursuit to strive towards something new or better or different started to shift in human consciousness away from being viewed as a bad thing and as like a vice, and instead towards something good and virtuous because of the way that just like the nature of how people were perceiving the world was really changed during this time. And obviously it's very important to also mention that most of the key figures who advocate, like of the Enlightenment era, who advocated for quote unquote individual liberty and freedom for all, were really talking about a certain subsect of people, which was, of course, the white man, white European men, and more importantly, if that man was wealthy or of upper class status. So the discoveries of the Enlightenment era were also categorized by violence and colonialism, and the imposition of like these new discoveries on populations of people that Enlightenment thinkers were interacting with at the time, because just basically on the basis of being like, oh, well, this is logical and this is reasonable and everyone should be thinking this way, and kind of viewing the world like this. So ambition, we're kind of starting to see it's on the up and up a little bit, but not for women and not even for white European women, the mothers and the daughters and the sisters of these Enlightenment thinkers, and not for people of color and not for Indigenous folks or members of populations that Europeans were attempting to colonize at the time, and not for people in Asia or other continents or cultures who had their own like really rich history of science and beliefs and kind of just a general history of how they understood the world, and also not for lower class and working class people, even lower and working class white European men whose labor was being relied on. So that, anyways, was a big, dense history compacted into something really small through the lens of ambition. But we can kind of start to see that just the progression of how ambition started to move into a more contemporary time. And I think that starts to kind of make sense as the precursor for another really, I would say, big moment in human history that is really categorized by ambition, which is the American dream, which I think, Al, you have some things to say about.
Yeah, I certainly do. Just a preface for my brief conversation with the American Dream is I'm taking a lot of this from Sarah Churchwell's book, Behold America. She's a professor of American literature and public understanding of the humanities at the University of London, but she's an American and she writes a lot about the American Dream. And I think it's really interesting to look at the American Dream through like a humanities and literature standpoint. I also am an English major, so this is something that I encounter a ton in my degree, is how the American Dream was written about, but also exemplified. And you can definitely see how it's tied to ambition. When I was doing this research, I was almost like kind of astounded by how intimately bound up it is with this idea of ambition. But essentially, the phrase has been repurposed from generation to generation. And the idea of the American Dream we have right now is probably the idea that emerged around the Cold War. But prior to the Cold War, the American Dream was not necessarily a conception of individual wealth. It was more of a dream of equality and justice and democracy for America specifically in its early days. And typically when you ask people today what they think the American dream is, they'll respond with some version of upward mobility, like upward social mobility, or some kind of like self-made personhood. And there's a lot of imagery that surrounds the American dream that we see repeatedly, which is, this idea of the white picket fence, the economic self-sufficiency and security. And a lot of people also associate this idea of the American dream with America being a land of opportunity for immigrants and for people coming to America to, have access to this dream. It's really interesting. I found the Oxford English Dictionary definition of it. And basically, the Oxford English Dictionary says that the American dream is the ideal that every citizen of the United States should have an equal opportunity to achieve success and prosperity through hard work, determination, and initiative. So there is this linking between labor and hard work and then prosperity and salvation. There's like a direct correlation between the two. And I think we see this a lot throughout history. And like specifically, even in the Enlightenment era, like the idea that if you work hard, there will always be reward is, a massive driver for ambition because, if you're rewarded for all of this work you're putting in. But as we know, the American dream was not always accessible to everybody, and it has never been accessible to everybody.
Right.
When the American dream was created, it was created for white European upper class individuals. And then it moved towards this like working class idea where everyone can achieve equality and, prosperity, but also that was still heavily, marketed towards very privileged groups of individuals,
right.
Specifically white men, still even working class, individuals. It was still marketed towards white men. And we know that the American dream was not always accessible and still isn't accessible for a lot of minority populations and women as well, especially. We hear a lot about the self-made man. There's not a lot of conversation about the self-made woman. Like it's very much so marketed towards one specific group of people. And it still exists today. I want to be very careful to talk about this as if it's like not just a historical moment in time, because what the American dream has become is like an ethos, so to speak, where I think it's this very elusive idea that a lot of Americans still kind of subscribe to and still kind of strive for. And there was this survey done, and adults under 30 are the least likely age group to say that the American dream exists, which is really relevant to our topic today.
Yeah, I think so.
40% of them say that like it doesn't exist in the first place. And 31% of people are completely uncertain. And 29% of the people who do believe exists, 9% of that group of individuals don't believe that it's attainable for themselves personally. And this is according to a study by YouGov from 2022. So it's quite recent. Which is to say that it's not that the American dream is a myth, so to speak, because it's very much real and it's very much a driving factor. But is it like an attainable, concrete idea? Not really. It's just more of a sort of ideology that a lot of people have adopted and continues today. And I think it was it was around, post-World War II when the American dream kind of fell into the hands of women where they started seeing it as an attainable goal for themselves, especially because they entered the workforce during the war while men were off at war. And then when men returned, a lot of women did not just want to go back to not working, which is how we get, our second wave feminism. And this leads us quite nicely into the 90s when we have the working woman trope, where essentially like women wanted to work and they were fighting to work. And I think you can speak more about this, but I do think this is kind of directly related to, for all of history, Americans were told like this is the land of prosperity. And now, starting around the mid 20th century, women are realizing that, this could also be an attainable goal for them.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have something to say about that.
I do. I have lots to say. So yeah, I want to just go back really quickly to just the topic of the American dream, because I think too, it's so interesting because I think that it has turned from like something that was like a concrete attainable thing to almost like a, like a picture for like national identity, I think.
Oh, for sure.
And like, I just find that that's really interesting that it's kind of transitioned away from almost like a step-by-step process to achieve prosperity in the US, or, you know, more broadly, I would say like North America or the US and Canada. And now it's kind of this like, this image, and it is almost viewed as like this moment in time. And I think that the messaging around that is also really interesting as well. And there was this quote from John D'Alessandro from the article I cited at the beginning there, where he said, as much as it is dismissed, condemned, and co-opted, the fact of the matter is that ambition drives the American dream. And I think that that's really interesting. I think that that could be read in a few different ways, where it's either that the American dream can be dismissed, condemned, and co-opted, or that ambition itself could be dismissed, condemned, and co-opted. And I think that we see those things kind of being interchangeably treated a little bit, whereas our idea of the American dream, or, you know, tropes like that start to change, our ambition also changes as well.
Yeah. And, you know, kind of like I said, when this... when the American dream we know today emerged, it was kind of emerging post the Cold War, which was a big time of nationalism in America, and nationalism for a lot of countries as well, you know, coming out of a war and then also going into like this period of extreme political turmoil. Of course, there is this rise of like national identity, and people want to feel connected and close to each other in times of tragedy and uncertainty. And I think that that was a big driving factor as well in creating these very ambitious people, is that, you know, people saw horror and tragedy and wanted to build better lives for themselves following that. And yeah, I think that quote is really potent, because I do think it's been co-opted a little bit, and it's definitely, you know, it's been used countless times over and over again.
Right.
But at the end of the day, like, it's still very real. You know, there are many people who very much believe, and even if they don't believe, there's still this subconscious ideology that it's attainable. And
or that group of people who believe that it exists but don't think that it's attainable for them.
Like, it's just so ingrained, and I think it's a big driving factor in ambition for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll kind of keep going here. So we also, so I'll touch on this a little bit, but this idea of like the 90s working woman. So after, you know, the war, and like what you were saying, women kind of had a little bit more of a stake in like the paid workforce. And this opened up the doors for this move towards this figure of a working woman. And so I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about this based on this article. It's an opinion piece from the New York Times. It was written, I believe, in 2017, and it's called, the title of the article is "The Best Era for Working Women Was 20 Years Ago." And that's by Bryce Covert. So I think it's a very grabby title. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that statement, but I understand like why they titled it that way. But it offers some interesting insights into kind of the boom of women in specifically like corporate spaces in the 90s. So the writer of the article kind of opens up by saying that the working woman as like a figure and as a theme and as a character was everywhere in the 80s and 90s pop culture. So like Dolly Parton in 9 to 5, Murphy Brown, Working Girl, like all those things. And that pop culture, as it does, you know, it was reflecting the world that it existed in, but then the world itself was seeing all these representations in pop culture and then mimicking it back. So during and after World War II, there was a steady march of significant numbers of American women into paid jobs. Women, of course, had to work before the war, but usually very specific groups of women. So like women of color and single women were the predominantly making up the presence of women in the workforce before, and they did not have nearly like the rights or the pay that was to come after the war. So the context for this boom of corporate women in the 90s was that, you know, the gender wage gap was shrinking, starting to shrink, and that women were ascending to higher and higher levels of education, which, you know, gave them this ambition in this sense that they could attain then higher and higher levels of professional status. And then the other thing that I thought was very interesting that also really contributed to this boom of women in the corporate workforce in the 90s was that contraception started to become more widely available, which meant that women could control when and if they became pregnant, which like was an absolute game changer for, you know, the space and the time that you have to be ambitious and to plan your career success and just the trajectory of your career. So all of these factors kind of fed into women being really highly ambitious about their jobs and their careers. And, you know, we've talked a lot about this kind of era with Marie, and Marie has said that during this time, like the messaging and what women were being told was that they were really just kind of being conditioned to believe that like they could have it all and they could do it all. But the all part was like the marriage, the kids, the family, the house, the personal life. And then like the cherry on top of the cake was like the job. But it really was like you had to have this like foundation, which is interesting because I think that, you know, men there's never really been a distinct period of men being told that they could have it all because they've kind of always just been able to have it all. But it's interesting that even, you know, if that is the case, there has never really been a caveat to that, of it being like, you can have it all, but first you got to really get your house and your family and your kids in order first. And then, you know, you can have the job too, if everything else is in order. For men, I think it's really not like that. But in the late 90s, technology kind of started to hit a turning point, which meant that there were fewer jobs and roles that were previously predominantly held by women because they could be automated. So, you know, things like space in jobs in like the retail space, office work, like reception, things like that were starting to be able to be automated. So women almost started to kind of be pushed out of the workforce again after like fighting their way into it. And then as we got into the 2000s, there's like the recession coupled with like the rising cost of childcare and like the lack of support for, you know, things outside of the workplace that are absolutely necessary to, you know, have in order, like childcare. And so this really started to impact how women's ambition progressed and like the space that they really had to be ambitious about their careers, as they attempted to continue to just push their way into the workforce, but were not receiving any help or support from the current systems that were in place. And so this is, you know, where women are hitting that glass ceiling that we talk about, where it's like after being told and being conditioned to believe that you could absolutely have it all and do it all, it's hitting this point where you actually can't have it all because you're capped off here and you can't go any higher.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think that kind of leads us into, I think the big part of what we want to talk about today, which is the pandemic and the post-pandemic and how that has just like wildly changed ambition in the workforce. And I want to start this off, Al, by asking you, what were you doing in 2020? What were you doing when the pandemic started? And what did your ambition look like at that time?
Yeah, I really hate this question because I typically answer this question and then people like kind of like wince. But I was finishing high school. Yeah, the pandemic hit in March of my senior year. I had not gotten into the school I'm at. I'm currently studying at McGill and I had not received an acceptance yet. So the pandemic hit, and at the time I was working so hard to get into McGill. That was like the goal. Mm-hmm. I knew that September was creeping up on me and I was going to move and, you know, and go to school and move out and all these things. And I was super ambitious about work, and I was volunteering at 2 non-for-profits at the time, and I was just absolutely running myself in circles. You know, I was taking 4 classes and doing all of these extracurriculars, and I was kind of like the pinnacle of the straight A, like always overachieving student. That's kind of exactly where I was. And then the pandemic hit. And a lot of that fell apart because, I had to stop working. I was working a part-time job on top of my volunteering, and all of that stopped. And then school stopped, and no one knew if we were going to be able to go to university in the fall either. So I definitely lost like a ton of my ambition as soon as the pandemic hit. I was like almost immediately just like crushed. I was in heavy denial for a while. And then I was suddenly like taking inventory of my life, and I realized that I was super burnt out.
Yeah.
And that...
Which at what point you were like, 17 years old?
I was 17.
And you're burnt out?
I was 17 and I was exhausted. Which is really, really bizarre to think about. And when I tell people this, they're like, well, what could you possibly have been doing at 17 that made you that tired? But I think we put a lot of pressure on young people, specifically young femme individuals, to put in the work and worry about the reward later, and just always be on the go. And this is like also the peak of, people on social media being like, girl boss and work as hard as you can at all times and have that like corporate dream life and
like hustle culture.
And
it's crazy. I remember like when the pandemic started and it was like immediately the first thing I was seeing when they announced like the 2-week like quarantine was like 2-week workout to like have a banging bod when you're out of lockdown, or like 2-week like productivity schedule to like get your life together during the pandemic. And it's like, can we breathe for a second?
Can we breathe?
We are in a global health crisis.
Yeah, right.
Like
and unfortunately for the first little bit, I was like, I can't fall behind.
Yeah.
Like I was like, I have to be as productive as possible. And that's just like simply like unsustainable. Where were you when the pandemic hit? Like what? Bring me back to 2020.
God, let me bring you back to 2020. Okay. I was finishing up second year of my undergrad of university. And I would say that I was pretty similar to you. Like I was kind of, I think, at like my peak of like ambition at that point, or ambition in like, I would say the more traditional sense. So at that time, I thought that I wanted to go to law school, and I had an internship set up like abroad that I was gonna go do in the summer of 2020, and like work at an NGO in Botswana. And I had that all set up, and that was like, I would say one of the more ambitious things I'd like kind of done, because I really just did that on like a whim. And I was like, I want to see if I could. It was like very highly competitive, and I wanted to see if I could do it, and I got it. And I was like, oh, okay. So I had that going on and just like finishing up school. And then literally like the moment that everything kind of happened, obviously that abroad internship got canceled for good reason. And then, I throughout the summer, I was also like really didn't take much of a break. I moved back to my hometown, and I, started working back at the job that I would usually like work full time throughout the summer, which was, a retail job in person. I was doing that like immediately, actually sooner than I would have, because we came back early from school. So I started working that, like, I want to say in like March of 2020. And I was studying for the LSAT. Like I was like really like, I was still very much like subscribing to that belief of, you're being forced to stay inside and to follow these protocols. You're not really socializing. There's a lot of things that you are not doing. And so therefore you should be using that time to be productive. It's like it's like the world giving time back to you, I think, was the messaging that was being kind of pushed out, I think, especially to a lot of like young people or just on social media in general. And I was like really subscribing to that. I was like, okay, yeah, absolutely. I will like study for the LSAT. I will write the LSAT a year before I need to, and all this stuff. And I did, and whatever. And so it's complicated. I think that like looking at it now, like I was definitely did not take the time to really process what was going on in the pandemic. And it was very intense. But at the same time, I think it really did also force me to kind of stop and wake up and really think about what I wanted, because, didn't want to go to law school. Like I didn't want to do a lot of these things that like my life was on track to do. And as I was like starting to I wrote the LSAT, I did fine. I was like starting to apply to law schools or like look at that. And then I was like, oh my God, like I don't actually want to do this.
Yeah.
And this is like a very expensive investment I'm about to make.
Oh, absolutely. Not a small life decision by any means.
No, God, even like paying to take the LSAT, I was like, well, that was a waste of a lot of money. Hey, it's fine.
I didn't know you paid to take the LSAT, first of all. I didn't know that was something, the process. Okay. Interesting.
You pay to take it and then you pay to get your results.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm now more confused than I was before, but
no,
understood.
So yeah, it's that's kind of where I was at. And then I think that it really did force me. And I would say that like my big like reckoning with like what I was doing and my ambitions and what I wanted to do next in my life, I was really kind of coasting. And I would say like in 2021 is when I really like stopped and I was like, okay, like what do I actually want to do? I was in a bunch of extracurriculars at school. I was in like Model UN and like international affairs stuff. And like I like quit those. I was like, I don't want to do these anymore. Like it was like a big moment of me, but it came about like a year after the pandemic of really like making the decision to leave certain things behind and to be like, it's okay to quit something if you like genuinely just do not like it. Like, yeah, it's fine. And so, yeah, just like moving away from that and moving more into things that like brought me joy and things that I wanted to do. So that's kind of where I was at in the pandemic.
And I think that mindset was a common mindset. And I think that was actually something we saw all across the board for a lot of people. I had a very similar experience to you. It was probably 2021 as well, where I did end up moving away for school in the middle of the pandemic. I moved 6 hours away from my hometown. Which was wild because I was completely alone in a city that I had only ever spent like a week in. And I like took an inventory of my life, you know, all I could do was sit in my room for essentially like 7 months and alone. And, you know, my parents were miles away and I had never lived on my own before. And it really made me consider what was important and what wasn't. And I think that happened with a lot of people. I think there was this kind of shared shift in kind of people's psyche. A lot of people went into survival mode during the pandemic, working to survive. And a lot of people were in very dangerous jobs during the pandemic. It was not safe to be working in person for a lot of individuals. And, you know, there was this idea, you know, going into the pandemic, and I think this idea obviously still exists, that you work hard now and then, you know, play later. You know, put in the work now, get the reward later. And then what the pandemic did was completely expose the myth of that, right? And I was reading this article by Emil Niazi for The Cut about the pandemic and kind of how it shifted everyone's perspective on work. And, you know, everyone had these big dreams and these ideas about what they wanted their lives to look like. And then something unprecedented happened. And, you know, people always say like, you never know what's going to happen, but really we had no idea what was going to happen.
Right. And I feel like too, that you never know what's going to happen is a very individual thing. It's like, you never know what's going to happen to you in your life as an individual person.
Right.
But this was like a lot of, like, it was like everyone was being exposed to this like shift to different degrees depending on, you know, like where you were at and you know, your privilege and stuff like that. But to an extent, like this was like a universal, like everyone had this moment of like, whoa, which I think previously was really only held by people if they, you know, themselves or a family member, a close family member had, you know, experienced illness or injury or major life altering things like that. And it kind of, it was, I think that sentiment was previously very individualized and this really like brought it to the forefront of everyone's
and I think young people especially were kind of, and I think this happened with almost everyone, where everyone was forced to slow down and look around and think like, hey, what's important and what's not, and who do I love and where do I want to invest time in? But for young people who were told, specifically the people that were entering the workforce and whatnot, who were told, you know, just work hard, just like push through it. You know, a lot of them stopped and realized they were burnt out. I know that happened to me. And I also know that a lot of people in the face of a global pandemic did not know how ambition was even supposed to show up anymore. Because we were all facing this new reality that no one had ever navigated before. And it's like, how do I be ambitious? And how do I have these goals if I don't even know if it's, possible to travel or to go to school or, to get this job. And then this idea that no matter like how hard you work, you still may not achieve or acquire all you want because there's always going to be these like uncontrollable things that happen. And I think this moved into something that there's been a lot of conversation about recently, what the term, the Great Resignation, which was coined by a professor, Anthony Klotz from Texas A&M University. And he coined this term in 2021 when America saw this spike in resignation rates. And, a lot of people, it wasn't just that a lot of people quit their job, but a lot of people chose not to return to work post-pandemic. And according to CNBC, 47.4 million workers in the US quit their job in 2021. And apparently, according to Microsoft's Work Trend Index, more than 40% of the global workforce was considering quitting. And then this continued into 2022. We saw 50.5 million people quit their jobs. And the sectors that were hit most heavily, which is no surprise at all, were hospitality and healthcare and education. So people that continued to work very hard throughout the pandemic and put their own kind of like emotional well-being on the line to take care of others during the pandemic. And
those like empathy sectors, empathy jobs that are also, have a really high presence of women working in those jobs too.
Yeah. And, Anthony Klotz, who coined this term, theorized that there was just this pandemic-related epiphany that happened where people started to consider their quality of life, and people were leaving jobs that they weren't entirely happy with because they weren't going to settle any longer. And I think for young people entering the workforce, they now came into the workforce with this ideology that they don't have to settle, that, life is unpredictable and you deserve to be in a space where you feel valued and respected. And I think that this definitely changed a lot of young people's attitudes towards work in general, and what they wanted out of work.
Yeah. And I think too, like with the move to things being online, I think that, and like remote work, I think that was and also a really interesting kind of space to navigate. And so for a lot of young people, their first, if people had worked like you and I had worked, part-time jobs or, jobs before, minimum wage jobs before the pandemic. And then, but for a lot of people, their first kind of experience working, a more long-term, a more serious, a more like, for lack of a better word, like grown-up job, was remotely. And so that was really interesting, I think, too, to navigate those standards because, a lot of companies hadn't operated remotely before. So it was like a learning alongside the company that is now employing you of like, what is acceptable and, how do we navigate this space? And there was this really interesting phenomena, I think, of this feeling of being constantly accessible to everyone during the pandemic because everything's happening, on your phone or on your laptop or whatever. And, that someone's sitting at home because there's a government mandated like lockdown happening. So like, you're not anywhere. I know you're at home. So like, why can you not answer my email right now? Kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think companies like to kind of bolster the fact that with remote work or with hybrid work, there's like this work-life balance to it. And some companies, like our company, do an exceptional job of actually delivering on those promises. But there are also a lot of companies that that is a big like driving selling point, I think, for people wanting to come to that company is like that hybrid work. And we're seeing this kind of, as it's evolving now, as we're sort of, COVID-19 is no longer like a global health crisis. We're moving back into somewhat of a state of like normalcy post-pandemic. And we're seeing still hybrid jobs or entirely remote work still happening. And it's about like striking that balance of offering remote work and, you know, promising things like work-life balance, and then actually delivering on that. And so I think that was also like a very interesting thing to navigate for young people of like not having previous experience of like what a quote unquote normal job looks like, and it being online. And for a lot of people, learning on the job alongside the company learning how to operate online.
Yeah. And I was reading this report by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and as of 2022, a third of Americans are still working from home.
Wow.
So, you know, it's hard to say that this was a moment in time, because I think that the pandemic like permanently altered the way we think about work. And I do want to recognize also that remote work is something that you do have to a certain extent, be in a very privileged position to like have access to.
Absolutely.
In 2022, 54% of remote workers had a bachelor degree or higher. So, or were pursuing a bachelor degree of some kind. And I think that's like a really important thing to note, was that people who were working to survive during the pandemic, and like even before the pandemic, there's not always the option to, you know, quit the job, find the better job. Work is necessary in a lot of ways for people to sustain themselves and their families and whatnot. But I do think that we saw this very permanent shift in just like the psyche of workers, and you know, this attitude towards work coming out of the pandemic that brings us to kind of the moment we're in now. And I think one of the generations it really predominantly affected was young people. And I think our idea of ambition is so different than it once was. And
yeah,
you know, I think go ahead.
I think too, like what's interesting about the, you know, the trend of the Great Resignation is that, I mean, I know that I kind of definitely fell victim to this. The framing of this is like, oh my God, everyone's quitting their jobs.
Yeah.
And now there's no workers, which, you know, as you said, there are people who quit their jobs or left their jobs, you know, during the pandemic and have not returned to work.
Yeah.
Or have returned to work in like, you know, a gig economy sense, or like starting their own business, or, you know, things like that. But then a lot of that is people reshuffling.
Yeah.
And there was the deputy director of the National Economic Council, Bharat Ramamurthy, he called the phrase, rather than the Great Resignation, he called it the Great Upgrade.
Right.
Which, you know, to refer to the pattern of people quitting their jobs and then moving out of like lower wage industries or lower wage jobs and moving up into higher wage jobs or higher wage industries. And I think the position that puts young people in is really interesting, because we're seeing people ascend out of junior level positions and into more, you know, mid to senior level positions, with, you know, the Great Resignation or the Great Upgrade, however you want to look at it. And now we're looking to young people into the future of the workforce to fill those junior positions. And, you know, young people are now, I think, more collectively conscious and more able to collectively organize, I think, because of social media than generations in the past, to be able to talk about and have conversations and understand like what standards they should and should not be accepting for their jobs. And so as we're, you know, trying to fill these junior level positions, you know, there's more, I think, I don't want to say more demands than in the past, but different demands. You know, I don't think that younger people are asking for necessarily more. I think just asking for different.
Yeah. And I want to speak to this idea of like, we're mobilizing more and we're having this conversation more. There was this article by Terry Nguyen for Vox, and it had a very buzzy title, and it was "Gen Z Does Not Dream of Labor," which is a really interesting title because
Oh, actually, I wanted to say that in one of our survey results, we had a female respondent between the age of 18 and 24 who, when they were asked what ambition meant to them, they actually quoted that exactly. They said, the phrase, I do not dream of labor feels very apt to describe how I approach ambition. So I thought that was like really interesting thing to add too.
So this phrase started going around social media. It was a buzzword that everyone was kind of using. And by everyone, I mean typically like the younger generations. And it was because young people were realizing that the workforce often forces you to be overworked and underpaid and underappreciated. And we see that young generations are experiencing higher levels of fatigue and burnout and dissatisfaction towards their jobs since the pandemic. And it's not that people have never been dissatisfied with their jobs before, that there's never been times of economic or global hardship. But there's a larger platform to talk about this now because of the internet. And also, like, if you think about the podcast we're doing right now, like, this is a space in itself where we're having these conversations, and people are now encouraged to speak more critically and pessimistically about labor and how it shows up in their lives. And, in a Business Insider report that I was reading, Gen Z is more likely than any other generation to change jobs. The workforce is completely changing. People don't stay in jobs as long, and there isn't as much stability. Like you mentioned, this gig-based economy. And I was reading this statement by this professor of labor and sociology from Penn State, Sarah Damaski, and she said that it's not necessarily that different generations hold different attitudes about work. It's that for millennials and for some of Gen Z, they've now witnessed 2 recessions back to back, and it's a very different labor market experience than what their parents or grandparents encountered. And it's incredibly disheartening as a young worker to constantly feel like you're in a state of uncertainty and precarity. And I think that has just, forced a lot of people to really reconsider where they want to be. And, especially going back to this idea of like work hard, play later. If the opportunity to build capital and kind of achieve these goals that we're told to achieve, such as like buying a house and like building a life, like if those are becoming less and less attainable, like of course your ambition is not going to be towards work if there's not reward in it for you anymore. Students are facing outrageous debt, and young folks in the workforce are realizing that they will never, be able to buy a house on the timeline that they thought they were going to.
Even like it's getting harder and harder to rent too.
Oh, for sure. Like the housing market, like as a renter, like it has changed so much in the 3 years like that I have been renting in Montreal. Like it is so, it is just, it was such a different world going into it this year. And there was a study that was done by Business Insider again that 34% of people between the ages of 14 to 25 don't think they're ever going to be able to own a home. And that's up 27% since the last time they did that survey in 2019, which is saying that, if people don't believe that all these goals they were like told that they were going to be able to achieve are achievable anymore, then, maybe ambition is going somewhere else. Maybe people are putting their labor and their drive and their work towards, another idea or another goal.
And I think that, when we did our little mini history lesson at the beginning of the episode, like the way that we talked about how ambition progresses, that it became more and more connected to work and to labor, but with the idea of, something like the American dream, it became connected to the idea of work for reward or work for this idea of like what is achievable. And now, like you're saying, there's like a disillusionment there. People are starting to realize that, that's not possible. So ambition is starting to go elsewhere. And I want to talk a little bit about mini like psychology lesson here as well when we're talking about this. So this is a Time article. It's called "Ambition is Out" by Jamie Ducharme. This was published in October of 2022. And in this article, they talk about, there's a psychologist and a professor at the University of Quebec in Montreal who studies motivation and ambition. His name is Jacques Forrest. And it's interesting because when ambition is researched in a scientific sense. It's often assessed by measuring someone's desire for things like career success, prestige, income, or higher education. And Jacques Forrest is really advocating and is saying that it might be better and it might be healthier to start to strive for things outside of those like kind of professional pursuits and to start looking at and studying ambition beyond that. So he's a proponent of self-determination theory, which again, we're doing a lot of like really big things that we're doing like quick little
Spark Notes versions
on it. But it's essentially a framework to look at human motivation and personality. And it says that there's different types of motivation. And one of those types is autonomous motivations. This comes from internal sources and is really highly connected to like someone's sense of self, and are much more, inherently like self-driven motivations. And then there's controlled motivation, where someone's acting on the desires for external rewards or out of fear of punishment. So even if you want an external reward, because it is something external to you, that desire is like not inherently like your own internal desire, the way that like an autonomous motivation is. Excuse me. So this theory, self-determination theory, argues that humans have 3 basic needs, like socially, and those are competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So competence, being competent and effective in dealing with your environment. Autonomy, being in control of the course of your life. And then relatedness, needing to have close relationships with other people. And Forrest basically says that when people are ambitious to achieve a goal that will feed into these 3 basic needs, ambition is a really, really positive trait to have and a really great thing to pursue. But when ambition is present to serve external factors, so something more like a controlled motivation, like money or status, research shows a higher level of dissatisfaction and even antisocial behaviors after achieving, what you set out to. So like the overall message here is that ambition is a really great trait to have, provided that we're engaging with goals that are not materialistic, such as wealth and clout, and, looking at it in a more, I would say, like holistic, internal, and like intrinsic kind of way. And this is obviously very nuanced because for a lot of people, competence, autonomy, and relatedness, those 3 basic human needs, are intrinsically and necessarily tied to money and power. For a lot of people, in order to have competence, autonomy, and relatedness, you need money and power.
Right.
Or you need to strive towards achieving money and power to be able to execute those other 3 needs. And in the research that was done, that found that the people who were striving for more materialistic reasons and were experiencing dissatisfaction, there was anomalies in that research that showed that people whose primary motivation was wealth, but for the purpose of like pulling themselves out of poverty or donating to charity, they don't follow those same trends of dissatisfaction when they achieve their goals. So we can kind of see how things are a little bit different there. And so I think that's kind of really hits on the nose of what we're talking about here, which is like redefining ambition and redefining how we look at ambition. And as the pandemic and just the state of the workforce has changed and how we navigate and step out into the professional world as young people, and I think even people of all generations, also understanding that with that comes a redefining and a reordering of ambition and, moving to making space to be ambitious about things beyond the professional or the career-driven world.
Yeah, and that's also not to say that Gen Z doesn't and millennials don't want to work. Like, well, I'm sure there are people that do not want to work. Like, of course, you're going to get that in every generation of people, but I think they just want work to look differently. And I think that's driven by this ambition that like shows up outside of just, wanting to acquire like wealth or a good title or whatnot. And there was a survey done for Yahoo Finance with a Gen Z population, and pretty much all of the respondents said that they were looking for more flexibility and livable salaries, and interestingly, healthy relationships with their coworkers and higher ups. Because I think that, like you said, with this theory, is that people and their relationships matter to people, and people want to feel like they're appreciated and heard in their roles, and that, might have come from a shift in sort of consciousness post the pandemic. But I think that need has always been there, where people want to feel, respected and valued in what they do. And that should be a driving factor for people. I do not think by any stretch of my imagination that it's unrealistic to be ambitious about something like feeling good about the work you're doing and, feeling good about the people you're doing the work with. Of course, you're always going to encounter a sucky job or two. People have bad jobs, and sometimes they're not fun. And, to a certain extent, work is necessary to survive. And I don't want to discredit that at all, but I do want to say that I don't think that it's a bad thing that Gen Z and millennials specifically have shifted their ambition towards, creating a better life for themselves in all facets of their lives, not just in, gaining more wealth or a better title. I know, from a personal standpoint, I would much rather be happy and healthy and feel respected in, a lesser paying job than being paid much more to feel very alone and not listened to. And I don't necessarily think that's a radical perspective. I
think it's treated radically though.
Yeah, for sure. But I think what we're getting at here is that work is not everything.
Yeah.
And, there's also a lot of shame in saying that. I think specifically for women, when you're not, putting all of your energy and ambition towards work, people, perceive you as almost going backwards. Because we have worked so hard to get to the point we're at,
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of intergenerationally shared shame between women and, femme people or people who were raised as girls, of older generations saying, I'm a trailblazer. Look at this path that I have created and that I have fought to, pave the way. And why would you not want to follow it? And it's this sense of feeling like you are, as a younger person, dishonoring or disrespecting the work that was put in before you. But I think it's about looking at, that's wonderful and that's great. The pathways that have been created by trailblazers, by female women trailblazers in, every industry. And getting to, step back and look at all of these options that are there for you as a young person and saying, great, and now I get to choose.
Right.
Which wasn't always the case for generations before us.
Yeah.
And so, I think that when we talk about redefining ambition and, moving ambition away from the workforce, I think that there is a lot of guilt that's harbored by young women and young femme people, because they feel this sense of obligation to carry on the torch, as it were, or to walk the path or travel the path that women before them couldn't, now that they're able to. And I think that's a really complicated issue to talk about.
Right. And I think one of the big reasons we did this survey in the first place, and, we've been having all these conversations about ambition, is we really wanted to highlight that, people's paths towards success and people's definitions of success are different. And there are many diverse ways that you can get to many diverse endings.
Right.
I know that a lot of my shame around not being ambitious towards work, when I feel that way, specifically just comes from this rhetoric that I have been socialized to believe that ambition can only be linked to the business world to a certain extent. And having it all. I don't think that ideology has necessarily gone away. And I just like briefly want to mention, because I did bring this term up earlier in the episode, this like idea of girl bossing, which I'm hoping that we get to do a full episode on.
I really want to do a full
this
episode
term, because I think
it's
so rich to discuss.
Yeah. It's a rich text for sure.
There's so much to say on it, but like just really briefly, this term like came about in 2014 after this woman, Sophia Amoruso, who was a very successful clothing reseller and ended up founding the business Nasty Gal. She published her autobiography called #GirlBoss. And it got picked up and the term got circulated and in social media, but in other spheres. And it took on many different forms and definitions. And in general, it's linking a woman or a femme individual's self-esteem or their self-worth to their job, creating a narrative that, like, if you're not actively trying to climb the corporate ladder or succeed in business, you're not working hard enough. And nor are you a strong woman who deserves to be respected and given the time of day. And you know, it gained its popularity with good intention. It was aimed at encouraging women to break into spaces that were stereotypically male, but I was reading this article from The Independent by Phoebe Schnedker, and she explains that it created a mindset of constantly wanting to achieve but never slowing down to appreciate what you already accomplished, which created a vicious cycle where you're constantly working and never, you know, feeling a sense of achievement. And, you know, unfortunately, what started as a way to encourage and empower women also became a way to disempower and put women down, and saying that if your ambition is not towards what I want your ambition to be, such as having a family, or like, you know, if someone's ambitious about building a family or having a home or these stereotypical, like, quote unquote, like woman things, like then they're not being forward and they're not being feminist, which is just kind of a ludicrous idea because
it's like very like reductive.
Right. And I think what we're trying to move towards in our conversations about ambition is like away from a reductive approach towards it and towards a more nuanced definition. Because ultimately we will leave so many people behind in having one strict definition of ambition. And I think young people especially get left behind when we get caught up in this classical definition of ambition, because that's not what ambition looks like for a lot of young people anymore. And that doesn't mean they're not ambitious. It just means they got different paths that they're on.
And I also feel like there is a really big notion that Gen Z in particular are, you know, they just get online and they complain. Which, sure.
Sometimes we do. I'm talking to like, sometimes we do get online and we complain.
But I think that, you know, for all that we are cynical or critical, or, you know, annoyed or disappointed by the system and the world that we live, I think that, you know, cynicism is a breeding ground for ambition. Because it's inherently looking at the world around you and identifying what is not working and figuring out how we can make it better.
And things change when people question the systems that have long been cherished, like, you know, and have long been deemed as working. And I think what the pandemic exposed, and I think what young people are trying to expose, is, you know, this single definition of what life is supposed to look like and what ambition is supposed to look like isn't working anymore. And that's okay. But that doesn't mean that, you know, I don't know, that Gen Z is anti-work. I think they're just, you know, pro asking for more and asking for different. And as the world changes, like our attitudes towards things like ambition and work need to change as well. I
think that like young people do a lot of work to like open up these conversations and to remove, you know, this stigma around, you know, asking for what you want in a workplace sense, asking for more money, asking for a raise, asking for more information out of job applications or in interviews.
Yeah.
And is really doing a lot to educate and to bring awareness to how we look at the workforce and ambition and, even things like economics and like global political systems. Like, there's a lot of work and a lot of really interesting research being
conducted
being
and
talked about and conducted.
Yeah. And I feel very lucky, and I don't want to speak for you, but I think you do too, to be a part of a job that, Marie always asks us to question and ask for more.
Yeah.
And I think that has set both of us up to, moving forward in the workforce, to be critical of the spaces we're in, and not, let ourselves slip through the cracks. And
it's such like a game changer to, have a work in a space where, your work-life balance is respected and your voice is prioritized and people actually care about what you want to say, and your feedback, you can see the feedback that you have for the company or for the work that you do immediately being implemented.
Right.
And that is such a privilege that we have and is such an asset to the company, I think, too. And it's about, when we're talking about this, like, as we were saying before, like, we're seeing, older generations retiring out of the workforce or moving up to more senior level positions. And we're seeing, younger people ascending into the workforce and even moving up into, mid to upper level positions in companies. And it's about your company being flexible and agile enough to have those conversations with young people and to include young people in those conversations. And I don't think that people are necessarily trying to exclude young people, but I just think it's, again, goes back to the, systems that have been in place for so long where, it's the upper level people, the people behind closed doors that have those really, in-depth and structural conversations about the way that the company operates. And with social media and stuff, I think that we're really like opening up all of those doors and bringing that conversation to like the masses.
Yeah. And I want to bring this back to like the report we just made, like pretty briefly, but to just say that when we were constructing this report, and we had a lot of conversations before we even started writing. We just, scanned over that data for so long to really pull what we thought was meaningful out of it. And really make sure that we highlighted some of these important like quotes and responses that we got. And I think the thing that we kind of landed on above all was that, one, we need to redefine ambition, but two, we need to continue to have these conversations.
Yeah.
This report is coming out and we're super excited for everyone to see it, and we've worked very hard on it. But it's step one, this is not the final product, and there's so much more to come and so much more to talk about. And
like, there's so many questions in the report that are questions for further research that we're really excited to keep looking into and to keep, digging into, and encouraging people to, bring this report also to their own companies, into the conversations that they're having about the workplace, and talking about it and talking about how this impacts and reflects within the spaces that they work.
And I think also we want people to be critical of the report, and we want people to look at this report with nuance and bring their perspectives to the table, because we fully acknowledge that, the scope of our research can only go so far. And there's so many voices and so many perspectives that, we didn't necessarily, have access to when we were making this report. And I think the goal is, when we continue to have these conversations, is to be critical, to think meaningfully about it, to open up conversations. And like you said, we have a lot of questions for people. And I want to bring in one question that you brought to this when we were researching for this conversation.
Yeah.
And it's by Stephanie O'Connell Rodriguez, who talks a lot about ambition.
Yeah. So I want to read, I think just she has this really nice, a little bit of a long quote, but I think it really sums up a lot of what we talked about here. So I want to read that, and then I think end on this question that I think is for us to reflect on a little bit, but also I think for like the broader community to really think about.
Yeah.
So Stephanie O'Connell Rodriguez says that when we link our ambition to how much we can cram into a day or how many weekends we can spend working per the hustle culture model, we can start to feel disenfranchised from our own ambitions. But ambition is not an amount of hours worked. It is not waking up at 4 a.m. It is not a diet and exercise or a productivity hack. It is not a lack of boundaries or a perpetual state of stress and busyness. It is not a single-minded hyper-competitiveness, chasing goals for the sake of checking things off of a list and climbing a ladder that might not even lead to where you want to go. To be ambitious simply means to have ambition, to drive to create a life that reflects your skills and potential, to be valued for those qualities and abilities that you experience and value in yourself. And I love that quote. I specifically think that like the words that really I've taken away from that is to be ambitious simply means to have ambition.
Yeah.
And when we talk about redefining like what it means to be ambitious, or, you know, whether or not you would describe yourself as ambitious, I don't think before doing all this research and talking about this so much, I don't think that I would describe myself as an ambitious person. I don't think that would even be in like the top 10 traits I would use to describe myself.
Totally agree. I like for myself, like I don't know if that's even,
I don't even know if it's crossed my mind, but I think after doing all this research and this work on ambition, and specifically the way that, you know, Rodriguez has framed that to be ambitious simply means to have ambition, it really like opens the door and does exactly what we're talking about here, to redefine ambition and say that, you know, you can be ambitious about your relationships and you are an ambitious person. You know, like you can have ambition about school and you are an ambitious person. Yeah.
And she asks this really, really lovely question that I think at Women Talk Tech, we've been thinking a lot about, but I want as many people as possible to sit with this question because I think it's so important.
Yeah.
And she asks us, how do we enable a system where we're allowed to experience ambition in all facets of our lives? And like, I don't know if there's really anything to say on that other than
a way to answer that. I mean, I think that what there is to say about that is, you know, exactly what we talked about is that how can we start to have those conversations about ambition? And I think it is about what we're talking about, of bringing to the top levels of companies. I think that, you know, change does often happen from the bottom, and it does come from the people and from the masses. But I think that change happens a lot quicker when the people at the top are, you know, ready to have those conversations with everyone. And, you know, within our company structure, like this episode of the podcast wouldn't have happened. Like this very episode would not have happened if we were not having these conversations. Because Marie was like, okay, go, what do you want to do?
Right.
And we were like, we want to do this. We want to do research episodes. We want to talk about these big issues that, you know, deserve a lot of time and research to get into. And so I think I would just encourage everyone to kind of be open to talking about ambition and to, you know, opening up the doors a little bit more, and not letting all these conversations happen behind closed doors.
Yeah. And I guess just to wrap up, I think that both of us, learned a lot in doing this, and, you know, about ourselves, but also just like about ambition in general. And as two people who work so heavily with the topic, like I think it's really important to kind of understand where our ideas around ambition are coming from and where they're going. And we hope that, you know, you go and take a look at the report. We highly recommend that you go and have a little read and, you know, see some of the things that people were saying about ambition, and just continue to have this conversation. And we know this episode was probably a little bit longer than you're used to, but we were just really excited to bring forth some of this research, and hopefully Marie lets us do it again. I guess we'll see.
We'll see. But I think that we'll wrap it up there. But the Ambition Survey is out now, and we'll have links to the Ambition Survey to the Ambition Report and all of our sources from our research today in the show notes. And, we hope that you continue to have these conversations and bring the report and bring these conversations into your own workplace as well.
Yeah. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And
we will see you next time.
Yeah.
Okay, bye.